like around. And I'll just pull on it just to get the material down the top. Thank you so much for letting me know this.
Yes? Thanks. Great, thank you. I think questions from the crowd will be great. So maybe we'll see, like, thank you so much. I'm Rainey Aronson, the executive producer of Frontline, the investigative series on PBS. I'm so excited to be here today. Of course, Frontline has a great depth of knowledge and also publishing on terrorism for years. Pre-9/11, but certainly in the last number of years, we've been looking closely at ISIS. We've had actual 4 big efforts around ISIS, starting when they started to emerge out of Syria, and we started to try to understand who ISIS is and what do they stand for. I'm so excited to have these guys on the panel today. In fact, we're researching and developing a film exactly on this subject. So this is producing an action. This will be wonderful to hear what they have to say. I think the first thing I'm hoping is that you can each introduce yourselves and answer this question, which is one of the most complicated questions, but try to keep it brief. How Muslim is ISIS? And I think that will set the stage for the variety of points of view here, and one of the most important questions that I think we can ask about ISIS. So let's start, sir.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. So get right into that controversial issue.
Well, no, tell us who you are.
Okay. Yeah, sure. My name is Shadi Hamid. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution. I do a lot of work on Islamist movements and the role of Islam in politics more generally. And I've spent really since, I guess, 2004, I've been spending a lot of time with Muslim Brotherhood activists and leaders throughout the region, trying to understand who are these people that we call Islamists, what animates them, what do they believe in, and pardon the book plug, but my recent book, which is called Temptations of Power, deals with a lot of those issues and trying to understand how Islamists evolve over time.
Yeah, I think the real question we're trying to ask today is how Muslim is ISIS?
Yeah, so
it's complicated, but just in a couple of
sure.
moments,
Just very,
explain.
So very quickly on that, I'm not a big fan of this whole kind of politically correct thing of ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. That's what a lot of my Muslim friends and colleagues, that's what they say, and I understand where they're coming from. But I feel like when you say that to an American audience, they're like, wait, what's going on here? We see this group called ISIS. They very clearly think that what they're doing is Islamic. So when we say, well, ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, it sounds detached from reality. So what we can say, I think, is that the overwhelming majority of Muslims abhor ISIS's ideology. So the polling that we have anecdotally, that seems to be pretty clear. But ISIS, the people who actually fight for the movement, they believe that what they're doing is right. They believe that what they're doing is true to the Prophet's model. We don't have to like it, but I think that when we're talking about religious actors, we have to take their beliefs seriously. We can't say, well, they don't really mean what they say, or ISIS are really just Baathists in disguise. No, let's take them seriously. If they keep on insisting to us, and if we look at pretty much all the primary source documents in Arabic, they very self-consciously are trying to kind of go back to what they consider is the kind of original essence in a very strict, uncompromising, vicious, brutal way, but they believe it.
Great.
Thank you. So my name is Maajid Nawaz. I am founding chairman of Quilliam, which we like to dub as the world's first counter-extremism think tank. Our role is to be a Muslim-led organization founded by former Islamists to tackle the Islamist ideology through civic engagement, debate, critical engagement, writing, and so on and so forth. We try and amplify our voices through various media, and crucially what we're attempting to do is, what you heard on the previous panel, is help with some of those counter-narratives and also help essentially in encouraging a reform discourse to emerge from within Islamic discourse. How I got to do that is I spent 13 years on the leadership of an Islamist group. 5 of them were in prison in Egypt as a political prisoner, adopted by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience under Hosni Mubarak. Interestingly, the cell he held me in eventually housed him and the interior minister who housed us as well. Mazra' Tora prison in Cairo. But you can hear more about that in my talk tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. To the question about how Islamic is ISIS. I remember one of the things that pushed me away initially from the Islamist ideology. And you know, when I use the phrase Islamist ideology, just to be very clear so there's no confusion, I'm not talking about Islamic faith. What I mean is a desire to impose any version of that faith over society. And when it's violent, I call it jihadism. These are distinct terms that I use in this meaning. You may have your own phrases. It's just what I mean when I use these terms. And I don't mean Islam and jihad. They're 2 other terms. They are also distinct. They have their own meanings as well. But when I say, for the purpose of this discussion, Islamism, I'm referring to the desire to impose a version of my own religion over society. And one of the conversations I remember having in prison that turned me off this Islamist ideology was a very detailed conversation with some of the forebearers of ISIS, discussing with me the detailed jurisprudence of how to enslave women. And this really leads to this point as to how Islamic is ISIS. We have this saying, there's no, we have, I don't know if you have it in America, but in English we have, because we obviously speak English and you speak American, but we have this saying called the no true Scotsman fallacy, which if you may have heard, this whole idea as to who's really a Scotsman, who's really a Marxist. Kalakowski was addressing this in essence as well, to address this question as to what's the true Marxist. And the question presupposes that truth lies in that very doctrine that you're trying to answer in the first place. What is the true Muslim presupposes that there is the definition of a true Muslim and a correct form of Islam, which presupposes belief. And that's the problem here, that most of you don't have that belief system in the first place. So the question is redundant. I think what Shadi said is correct. They consider themselves Islamic, and that's all really that matters in answering this question. I think it's incorrect to say they've got nothing to do with Islam. It's also incorrect to say they have everything to do with Islam. The truth is, they have something to do with Islam. What is that something? That something is that they justify their own vehemently repugnant ideas by using Islamic scripture. Now, that's important for us to know, because when we're engaged in counter-narratives, when we're engaged in psyops against them, when we're in fact engaged in encouraging other religious Muslims to challenge them, it's important to know how they justify their own views from Scripture and where the weaknesses are in that scriptural reasoning. But let's not be fooled. It is a scriptural reasoning that they're employing. And I fear sometimes in this debate, because we want to be polite and we don't want to be seen to be racist, and we want to be politically correct and all of those things, which are important in their own right, I fear sometimes we succumb to what I've come to call of late the Voldemort effect. And those of you who haven't read Harry Potter may not know what I'm speaking about. I read all seven Harry Potter books in prison, in Mazra' Tora, which I told J.K. Rowling on occasion when I had dinner with her. And she was shocked. But the truth is I read all of them. And actually the bad guy, the evil guy in these Harry Potter books is called Voldemort. Now, everyone is so petrified of mentioning his name that 2 things happen. One is that they deny he even exists. And 2, those who do want to acknowledge he exists are told do not name him, but rather refer to him as he who must not be named. Now, these 2 problems, I think, we've fallen for this effect when it comes to looking at the Islamist ideology. The previous panel also correctly said, I think it was Farah Pandit who said, that ISIS is merely the latest manifestation of this. There is going to be something after ISIS, and there were many, many such groups before ISIS. And this is the problem I have with focusing our attention just on ISIS. That if we cannot understand there's an ideology beyond this and behind this, and if we're too scared to name that ideology, we succumb to that Voldemort effect. What it does is it increases the hysteria. Because if we cannot isolate this ideology from the traditional faith of Islam, then the average, ordinary, everyday person who isn't well learned in all of this debate may think every Muslim supports ISIS. And in fact, the surveys and the various polling indicates the opposite. So we have to have this open conversation, even if it's uncomfortable, even if my own community feels instinctively defensive, even if sometimes people get offended. But listen, people were offended at the idea of the female vote when it was first floated as an idea. That doesn't mean we don't have the conversation. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I was discussing with the panelists earlier that just this morning we're working on a film called Escaping ISIS, which is looking at how ISIS has actually captured many of the Yazidi. And one of the things that we were able to find is some footage that was captured that's undercover that really has them talking about their feelings about Yazidi women, in particular, their ability to enslave and also the ability to marry women, girls, at the very young age of 9. So a lot of the footage that's starting to emerge, not the propaganda footage that they're putting out themselves, is using this type of ideology inside their own conversations. The unedited version of what they're saying inside their own community is something that we're going to be exploring in our upcoming Frontline. Graham, you had a really influential, provocative piece. In fact, it was required reading at Frontline. We had it on every single desk of every editorial person. One of the interesting things is we pulled all the response to Graham's piece, and it was massive. And I said I would hand it over to him because it has really started an important conversation. Tell us a bit who you are, but also I know you wrote this incredibly long piece, so if you can, just briefly. When you come at the other end of writing something like that, with the amount of response you've gotten, have you changed your mind at all? Would you have asked different questions?
So taking the last question first, I referred to an area of Philadelphia as a dangerous area. Apparently it's fully gentrified by now, so I would change that aspect of the piece. Most of the rest of it, though, I would keep roughly as it was. So yes, my name is Graham Wood. I am a writer for The Atlantic. I've written there since 2006. And have been going back to Iraq off and on since 2003. The piece that you're referring to is one that I started in the middle of last year. And it was sparked in part by the question of what does ISIS really want, and what can we find out just by talking to supporters of ISIS and asking them what motivates you? What are the things that you think that this organization is able to accomplish that you care about? And I sort of joined Shadi in being a bit annoyed that this question, how Islamic is ISIS, is one that we have to talk about. And so I blame the President of the United States for so clearly taking one position on this. And as a result of that, we're having this discussion now. To say that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, that it's not Islamic, my response to that, conditioned of course by these interviews with supporters of ISIS, was that even the barest examination of the documents that exist from within ISIS and from conversations with its supporters, you have to acknowledge that yes, they believe that they are following Islam. And when they justify both to themselves and to the rest of the world what they're doing, they are drawing from this diverse tradition of Islam. Now, it's a diverse, and I hasten to add, a contradictory tradition. There's many different Islams. And there are many different ways that one can be a Muslim. Now, ISIS has a very minoritarian view of Islam. They believe that they're Muslims and that most people who call themselves Muslims are not. So
that's an important distinction, what you just said, and I hope you can talk a bit about that, Dahlia, because that's important. Yes.
I'll say one last thing about this question. Among the four of us right here, I'm in some ways at a loss, because as a non-Muslim, there are two aspects of the question of whether ISIS is Islamic. One is a question that I think Muslims alone decide, whether ISIS is properly Muslim, whether they follow the right kind of Islam. And then the second question, of course, is do they derive inspiration from, again, this diverse 1,000-odd year tradition of Islam? That question is one that non-Muslims can answer. And the question of whether they derive inspiration from Muslim texts, clearly the answer is yes. Just as Messianic settlers in Israel would derive inspiration from Jewish texts, and would we say that they are not Jewish just because they're from a very minoritarian view of what Judaism is? Absolutely not.
Dahlia, I loved your book, and we had just talked before the panel. Are you going to be writing, first of all, tell them about your book. Also, will you be writing a new book, because it published in 2008, and the world has indeed changed. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, great, thank you. My name is Dahlia Mogahed, and I direct research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. I was formerly with the Gallup organization, where I led research on Muslims around the world. I wrote a book with John Esposito called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And it was an attempt to in a scientific way, give ordinary people a voice. So there is the outcome of hundreds of thousands of interviews from more than 40 countries, representative Gallup polls, asking ordinary people about their views on lots of things, from women's rights to democracy to violent extremism. So the question of how Islamic is ISIS or how Muslim is ISIS is actually a little bit of a trick question. So I'm going to step back a bit and explain what I mean. If the question is, do they claim to be, or do they actually sincerely in their hearts derive inspiration from Islamic texts to justify their brutality? The answer is, of course, yes. I mean, that's kind of an obvious point. But I want to answer a slightly different question, which is, if Islam did not exist, so if we just, imagine this for a moment, would a group like ISIS, with all the other realities as they are, exist today and do the same things? And my answer to that hypothetical question is a resounding yes. And here's why. Because when you look at violent extremism generally, not just ISIS, but globally, you find that groups conduct the same kind of violence and will justify it using the local social currency. That is sometimes Christianity, that is sometimes Judaism, that is sometimes Buddhism, and it is sometimes secular ideologies. So a world without Islam would still have a group like ISIS. They would just be called something else that's maybe less catchy. And I want to also point out something else. Forget globally, let's look in terms of a timeline. In the same region, we had terrorism in the Middle East before there was a pronounced Islamic social currency. So there were secular terrorists, right, in the mid-1900s. They called themselves fid'ayin, or basically the sacrificers, those who would sacrifice for their cause. And they were secular Arab nationalists, mostly socialists, who conducted terrorist attacks, but under a very different ideology, because that was the social currency of the time. It was an Arab national social currency, so that's what they used. So my alternative explanation of the facts on the ground is this, just for all of you to consider, that it's not Islamic texts driving the violence, or it's not the interpretation of Islamic texts that is driving the brutality, but it's the desired brutality that is driving the interpretation of Islamic texts. We start at the violence we want to conduct, and we convince ourselves that this is the correct way to interpret the text. Now, as all of the panelists have said, their views are, and I will very generously say, minority views. Another alternative way to look at it is there is a normative set of beliefs within Islam. Islam is not anything and everything, okay? It is a distinct set of beliefs, and there are some normative sets of beliefs which they, according to the vast majority of authorities on these normative beliefs, i.e. scholars, contradict these beliefs. There was a very important letter written and signed by hundreds of Islamic scholars sent to ISIS actually arguing for this. Like, hey guys, you got it wrong, from these authorities to the leadership of ISIS.
So I asked the panelists before we started, did they want to have questions from the crowd? And they really, really do want to hear from you all. So we have about 15 minutes. Please, right in the front.
I want to ask all of you, because I'm not that well educated about, only a little bit about what you're talking about and what I read about. And I've read Hersey Alley's books, first Infidel, and then I'm just finishing Heretic. Have any of you read Heretic?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So,
Oh, I can't
I've read
wait
all
to
of
hear.
it, but I've started it and also read the op-eds that have come out. But
Okay. Because she believes in a reformation. And I thought, I don't want to speak, I don't want to be inappropriate or disrespectful, but I love her books. And I love this book because it made sense.
Yeah. So I actually have major issues. I think actually her subtitle is wrong. Her subtitle in the book is Why Islam Needs a Reformation. I think she misunderstands both the Protestant Reformation and Islam and how both of those, you know. But let me just. But in all seriousness, I mean, look, we can respect what she's trying to do, but we can say, well, is she making sense on this? And why do all societies and cultures and religions have to have a reformation? Islam isn't necessarily like Christianity. Christianity went through a particular process that ended up at this historical endpoint of liberal democracy. But what if the majority of Muslims or the majority of Arabs in a particular area decide that they don't want to be liberals, that they want Islam and Islamic law to play a central role in their lives? And this is where I might disagree a little bit with Maajid, that I don't think so when we talk about Islamism, there's the Islamism of ISIS, but then there's the mainstream Islamism. And for me, Islamism just means people who want Sharia to play a prominent role in public life. And as long as you're calling for those things through a legal democratic process, we don't have to like it, but we have to respect that. And that's where I think groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or Ennahda in Tunisia are very different from groups like ISIS, even though they're all under the umbrella of Islamism, right? But I think we have to ask ourselves as Americans, why do Muslims, I mean, we're not, and this is where I don't like this language of we're all ultimately the same. What if we're not all the same? What if we want different things? And I think that calls into question this idea that we all end up with liberalism or a reformation or whatever it happens to be. And I think that's where Ayaan Hirsi Ali is maybe trying to push Muslims to be something which they don't necessarily want to be or have to be.
If I could just add one thing, I think the main issue is misdiagnosing the problem. And you misdiagnose the problem by analyzing the facts in isolation rather than looking historically and globally. So what Ayaan tends to do is find problems in Muslim societies and then attribute Islam to those problems and then comes up with a solution as we need to fix Islam. Whereas she ignores the socioeconomic, political drivers of many of those problems and ignores the facts that those exact same problems occur in other societies where Islam doesn't exist. So the idea of fixing Islam comes from a misdiagnosis of the problem in many cases by isolating that problem. The other danger of reforming Islam or this idea of let's make Islam whatever we want it to be is actually that's what the terrorists did. That's what ISIS did. Hey, we want to be able to enslave girls and have this many sex slaves. Let's make Islam so you can. So the idea of letting everyone do whatever they want with Islam doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get an outcome you like.
Great. Did you want to add anything, Graham?
Just to add to that point, I think it's clear that what ISIS is doing is itself a kind of reformation. There are interesting parallels between ISIS's program and the Reformation in Christianity. In both cases, you have a movement that devolves authority from scholars to ordinary people, that goes back to text in an incredibly scripturalist, literalist way. And finally, also that's accompanied by technological change. The internet in this case, the immediate availability of scholarly or amateur even text and interpretation to anyone who wants it. In the case of the Reformation, it was through print. Now, the internet.
Great. We have a question right here in green.
I wanted
Yes,
to touch on
of
this.
course. Yeah.
Sorry, apologies. I want to come out with a bit of a different perspective here, if that's
Great.
okay.
Please.
I'm going to defend Ayaan from a position of disagreeing with her. I'm a Muslim. She's an ex-Muslim. If I agreed with her, I'd be an ex-Muslim. However, I think that what we're losing here is that we're getting stuck in the meaning of the word Reformation. I don't think she literally wants to mimic the Christian Reformation. I think I've been in personal dialogue with her and Sam Harris. In fact, I'm releasing a book with Sam on this very topic, due to come out this October. And it's about whether it's possible indeed to address some of these questions from within the Islamic scriptural basis. I think all she really means is a small r reform of Islamic discourse. Now, if we're going to separate Islamism as I defined it and as I use it as the desire to impose a version of Islam over society. And yes, there are different types of Islamists. And I'm very happy with the progress that the Hizb al-Nahda have made in Tunisia. I think that's a wonderful example for the Muslim Brotherhood to copy. But if we're going to separate Islamism from conservative Islam as practiced in sort of social conservatism in the vast majority of Muslim majority societies, and then if we're going to ask the question that does conservative Islam need a small r reform to address some issues of misogyny, to address some issues of homophobia, of anti-Semitism and other issues, then I think the answer is very frankly yes. But that doesn't mean that we mimic the Reformation as it was historically. It just means we have to have an open conversation about some of the challenges of Islam coming to terms with modernity, as every other religion has gone through. Islam is 600 years older than Christianity. Christianity went through it, Reform Judaism exists, Judaism from the Old Testament literalist version has gone through it. You know, there is an issue among Muslim majority societies to address some of these questions. And I think really if we understand generously in that sense that that's what she's pushing for, her views have changed over the course of her books. Whereas she used to say Islam needs to be destroyed or obliterated, to now saying it needs a reform, that change in view needs to be from a Muslim voice. That should be encouraged and not dismissed because it's a positive step forward.
Great, thanks.
Check.
Great, thank you.
I have an opinion, and then I'm going to back it up, and then I'm going to ask you if you agree or disagree. I think the United States way overreacted to terrorist threats from 9/11 onwards specifically. And the reason that we're told is that it's about American lives. You know, we don't want to lose American lives. We lost 3,000 in 9/11. We've lost about 1.5 million in our wars since the Revolutionary War. That's about how many Americans have died. According to the American Medical Association, between 100 and 200,000 Americans die every year in our hospitals by mistakes, which means since 9/11, we've already lost more Americans than we had in all of our wars. That's why I think we've overreacted if we're really concerned about American lives. I'd love your all's opinions on that.
Why don't That's a deep question, Shadi.
Well, sure.
Why don't you answer that and we'll move on to another question
Okay,
as well.
so I don't actually think ISIS is really about us. And I feel like we're so American-centric. ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda, is more focused on the Middle East. That's not to say that they wouldn't love it if they're, and that's happened, that there are people who are inspired by ISIS who commit attacks in the West. But ISIS as an organization is fundamentally focused on capturing and holding territory in the Middle East. So, but even if it's not 100% about us, it doesn't mean it shouldn't matter to Americans. Do we want an extremist, expansionist, neo-state in the middle of the Middle East? I would venture to say that the answer would be no. But I would also say that ISIS is not primarily a terrorist organization. That's not how I see them. And as Richard Haas said in the earlier session, they have this interest, unlike Al-Qaeda, in capturing territory, and importantly, in governance. That's what makes ISIS so revolutionary and so distinctive as an organization. They actually are trying to do something, establish a caliphate, which no one really did before. Al-Qaeda would talk about the caliphate as an aspiration or an inspiration, but they didn't actually do it. That's where ISIS has set a new standard for extremist groups going forward, and that's why they should matter to us, because for the rest of our lives, whenever there's an ungoverned space, there's going to be that little extremist group that says, well, why don't we establish our own mini caliphate or mini emirate, just like ISIS did?
So, I mean, Dali, I'd love you to just take this one step further. So you're talking about the underpinnings of this and the actual origins of this. Why now? And some of the criticisms of Graham's piece, people kept saying, so, well, why now? Why is this happening now? So I'm just wondering if you can help us with that.
You know, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but some ideas of why now is Bashar al-Assad. That's, why now is he has massacred far more people than ISIS has, and when you have a situation of such brutal genocide that is completely ignored by the rest of the world, and a failed state basically in these two countries, you will see ugly things come out of that. In this case, it was ISIS, and it took on, again, the coloring and the veneer of its local currency, which was Islam. When you see ungovernable or ungoverned failed states in Africa, the brutality takes on, a different hue, a different ideology. So Why now? I think it's the product of the brutality of this war that we've ignored and allowed to continue.
Great. Yes, please.
Expressed before that I just wanted to hear more about the Muslim view of radical Islamism throughout the world that you did extensive interviews and research on. I'd like to hear more about that if I could.
Sure. Well, as actually my fellow panelists have mentioned, the polling that Gallup has done and other organizations has done showed that the vast majority of Muslims around the world condemn violent extremism, attacks on civilians. So you can actually access this report still on the Gallup site. It was done 10 years after 9/11, and it looked at global views of attacks on civilians. So it wasn't just Muslims, but it actually looked at 100 different countries. So it was people of all faiths. And what you find is that Muslims are at least as likely as people of other faiths to condemn attacks on civilians. But I think what's even more important is when you look at the ordinary people and you ask them, why do you condemn this act of violence? It's these people who actually bring up religion. It is people who are voicing an opposition to violence against civilians that are quoting from the Quran. And these are global studies that are representative. Those who condone the violence, the minority that say that they sympathize with it, they do not give religious justifications. They are actually giving political justifications for those views. So when you look at the issue empirically, what comes out is a picture where it is politics driving these issues and not a religion coming out, verses coming out of the Quran and mind controlling kids to go join ISIS.
Maajid, please.
My country, Britain, just lost roughly 30 people, among other nations, in the horrendous attacks that just occurred in Tunisia. And I want to mention, just to reinforce something Dalia just said, that there were Tunisian Muslim citizens who formed human rings around the tourists as they were being shot at, putting their bodies before the bullets. And they were shouting, Allahu Akbar, which is exactly what the terrorists shout when they want to kill civilians. They were shouting the same word, God is great, in attempting to put their own lives before the tourists that this terrorist was attempting to kill. So first of all, if I ever saw any of those Tunisian Muslims, I would embrace them as our brothers and sisters. And so Dalia is correct that that same faith has motivated people to profound acts of courage in the opposite direction. Now I want to say something where I have a slight disagreement with perhaps some of my co-panelists. And that is, however, we've got to understand something. I often worry that the bar has sunk so low when it comes to discussing Muslims. I call it the poverty of expectation. We're expecting Muslims to be so savage that we're delighted when we hear a Muslim say, I don't want to kill you. As if I deserve a thank you for saying I don't want to kill you. And that's what I call the poverty of expectation. Really, that should be the default baseline of a conversation anyway. The real question, what I'm really interested in, is not how many people support ISIS, because actually the majority of Muslims condemn ISIS. That still puts us in the same camp as, among others, among the majority of normative Muslims. It also puts us in the same camp as Al-Qaeda, as my former organization, Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a revolutionary Islamist group, as many other types of Islamists, Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, Islamic Jihad, they all condemn ISIS as well. So what I want to do is look a bit deeper as somebody who comes from within that community, who is desperately concerned with reforming some of the problematic aspects. And that is that I'm not just satisfied with us condemning the murder, but the attitudes beyond that. And they, when you take surveys in the United Kingdom, 33% of British Muslims say that they aspire to a notion of a theocratic caliphate. I find that troubling. Now, that doesn't mean they want the ISIS form of a caliphate, but we have to recognize that European Muslims, not American Muslims, there is a difference, but European born and raised Muslims are grappling with questions of identity and modernity and faith in a way which is troubling and needs to be addressed and openly spoken about. 33% for a caliphate is too many.
Thank you so much. Do you want to just respond quickly?
Really quick.
Thank you.
Maajid, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you to a certain degree, but I think we also have to interpret how these polling questions are being understood by the respondents. one thing I want you to keep in mind is that in the United States, 55% of Americans say that they think the Bible should inform law, okay? 9% think it should be the only source of law. I still think we're a democracy. So the fact that people have, ideas about religion informing law does not make them terrorists or extremists.
Thank you so much, all of you, and your questions. And this is going to continue, clearly. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was amazing. It got more interesting at the end. You're incredible. I really hope.
Yeah.